Hello there. Welcome to or welcome back to my channel, Snips by Kelly. I'm Kelly, and today we'll be turning a basic sketch into a beautiful heritage scrapbook design. It's time to hop, and today's sketch and scrapbook design is part of a monthly YouTube sketch hop where 8 creators each create their own scrapbook design based on the same sketch, and it's so much fun. Today's sketch is by the talented Katy Taylor over at Scrappin Katy. It is a unique but simple sketch, and we'll be creating a beautiful heritage design to document an old family photo. Now, right away when I saw the arches in the design, I thought of our new everyday arches. All of these layered arches with stitched edges that would work perfectly for this scrapbook design. We also have some other things from our brand new online exclusives that are dropping in March, such as these fancy border dies. Now, close to my heart had some fancy border dies that I used and used and used and used. I love them so much, and I'm so happy to have an additional set now that have a little bit different of curve to those edges. I love these edges to make borders for pages and cards. So here you can see I've been working on using the Everyday You and Me collection and creating a really cool card edge. I think that these fancy border dies would work great on this layout sketch by Katy to make unique edges on curved design. So you could actually just create a rectangle and then create an interesting curved design with those fancy borders. Those everyday arches actually do win out for me though, and I do end up using those. Now I'm going to be using a 5x7 vintage photo from 1968 of my family, so I do think I'm going to have to already alter and rotate the sketch. But I have a surprise for you today. You get to see another online exclusive that won't be dropping until March. Now, within the Natural Botanicals suite, there are 2 separate designer series paper packs. There is the Natural Botanicals, which really spoke to me as leaning toward heritage. But on further looking, there is so much more. Nature, masculine, and I actually am thinking sports. So although one side has the leafy patterns, the other side has the natural black and gray wash. And I have so many grandchildren that have black in their sports teams. So they have like black and white, black and orange, black and blue. And I think this would be great for masculine, nature, hiking, outdoors, and sports. Now we also get the Woven Textures Designer Series paper in the Natural Botanical Suite that's dropping in March. And this just screams like its name, texture. You have a little bit of a woven look, you have burlap, a little bit of a linen look, all of those neutral and natural tones that we've been asking for more neutral pages. I really love it, and I think it's going to work great for my heritage layout today. So I'm going to be using this 5x7 photo of my family in 1968. This is a family photo that's super special to me because my mother and my brother have since passed. And so it is one of the only family photos that we have at this age with my brother and I. I believe the next family photo that we would have been 7 years after that. And so I'm going to love documenting that. Now in the Natural Botanicals, there is also a stamp and die set. There's a Textured Notes cling stamp set and Textured Notes dies that have decorative rectangles. There's also a mini corrugated 3D embossing folder that's included in this set. There's a little bit of white ribbon, and then there's also, of course, some coordinating dots. The dots are called neutral matte dots. Now, I'm pulling out a lot of other things just because I'm trying to experiment with what I might be using. We also have a collection that's dropping in March that includes the on-the-go tags and dies. Now it's meant to coordinate with a travel set, but I absolutely love the locks and keys that come in this set. They are vintage. They totally remind me of something that would go on a heritage layout. I'm also going to pull out storybook friends that have some vintage looking frames in them. I'm not exactly sure what all I'm going to use at this point, but I'm definitely using this 5x7 photo. Now this is an original photo. It has some writing on the back from my grandmother, and I really want to protect it. I could scan it and use a copy of the photo, but with my mother having passed, my brother having passed, I'm really the only one that is going to keep this photo and tell the story. So I'm going to put it in a 5x7 flip flap. Now we have flip flaps, signature flip flaps on our shop site now in Stampin' Up. We don't have 5x7 size just yet, but we do have, I think, 2 or 3 other sizes. I'm going to start the layout with a 12x12 very vanilla, and that's going to be my base. But as you can imagine, with anything vintage or heritage, we're going to distress it and dirty it up quite a bit. So I'm going to pull out those everyday arches and just sort of see what I think in terms of the size that I think is going to fit that will match Katy's sketch. I end up going with the 4.5-inch arch, and I use the burlap paper from the Woven Textures, and then I create the 4.1/8-inch arch with black cardstock. I think that's going to be sharp. Of course, I'm going to distress the edges a little bit, but I love it already. Those arches are incredible. You get so many, and they're 1/4 of an inch different. So I'm already changing up the sketch a little bit and putting the arches on the side instead of the top. I'm going to use one 5x7 photo instead of 2 3x4 photos, and I'm going to use the flip flap and have it flip up so that I can add some special journaling or private journaling on the interior. That's going to actually allow me 2 sections for journaling because I don't have another photo to add. Now, as far as the patterns, I want to use the patterns from the black and white set, and I end up landing on 3 3/4 by 6.5, which I think will get the spacing right, and there'll be a little bit of spacing in between. Now, I really want to tie in the arches with the designer series paper and from the Botanical Textures, and so I'm going to go with some smaller pieces that are 2 1/4 by 2.5, and I'm going to make those the matching patterns. I've cut a 5x7 photo mat for the 5x7 photo, excuse me, a 5 1/4 by 7 1/4 photo mat for my 5x7 photo. And then I cut 2 additional very vanilla pieces that are 5x7 for the inside of the flip flap and then the base of the black. And I think I'm going to be able to tell a story in there and then maybe put just some dates in there, names and dates for our lineage in case my children or my grandchildren are curious about that lineage. It'll be pretty simple on the inside. I'm not going to do a lot. I just want to get this documented and down. So I'm going to actually use an edge distresser, and I'm going to distress and bend all of the edges of the very vanilla piece. So the very vanilla is 11 3/4 by 11 3/4. I changed my mind against the 12x12, so I'm going to go with the 12x12 black as the base, and then 11 3/4 by 11 3/4 very vanilla. You can distress the edges with your scissors or with an edge distresser, and I'm really going to give it some good creases, almost like a deckled edge. So there are some deckled dies that we actually have that scream vintage or heritage, and I'm going to make a little bit of a deckled edge here on this. You can do just a teeny bit of distressing, or you can do a lot lot more depending on what you would like. Now, of course, we want it to be yellowed. We want it to be yellowed like the photo or like a vintage photo, maybe giving it a little bit of that sepia tone. So I'm going to, of course, ink every little thing with pecan pie. So the thing about making heritage scrapbook layouts, you definitely want to choose a vintage color palette. Earthy tones like sepia, beige, brown, even deep reds or soft blues. You can use muted pastels if you're going to do a little bit more of a romantic look. So now you can see that I'm going to change the orientation here, and I'm going to think about some of the little things that they use to maybe decorate those arches up a little bit. But one of the first things that I want to do is I want to do some background stamping. I really want to have some little distress stamps or some word stamps coming through in between the arches. Now there isn't a lot of space, so a lot of what I stamp back there isn't going to show. I just want the background stamping to show through just a tiny bit. I'm thinking that I want to use one of the braided rope stamps that are in the textured note stamp set, and probably I will bring in Elements of Text, which is a text stamp that I've been using quite a bit. So I'm not sure that this is necessary because I end up having to stamp more, but I do originally use pencil marks to kind of figure out where the little bits and pieces might be peeking through. So here you can see this little braided rope distress stamp on the textured notes, and then of course all of the word stamps on the Elements of Text stamp work great as well. So definitely when you're doing heritage or vintage layouts, black and white is really a timeless classic feel. And then of course, distressing techniques all the way through. Inking edges for an aged look, tearing and layering, ripping or tearing pattern papers and laying them for texture. Sometimes you'll see a coffee stain or a tea stain making that, or even a little piece of lace or something for an authentic look. I'm actually using the Memento Black here, and I'm just using the Memento Black, and I'm just randomly trying to stamp in between some of those arches. So usually when I'm thinking about, like, again, a vintage or a heritage layout, you're going to want to incorporate vintage elements. One of my go-tos for vintage pages, of course, are doilies. Doilies and lace are more of a delicate, old-fashioned touch, but I also think about metal embellishments like brass, like keys, clock faces, and small frames. So that was the reason that I pulled out those Friends of the Forest frames, and also the tags to go on that are the brand new drop for the On the Go collection. So now you can see that I'm still just trying to get a little bit of the blotch stamp from the Elements of Text, and I'm actually using pecan pie for that one. So I did all of the stamping in black except for this little blotch stamp that I'm doing just a little bit in pecan pie. Another thing that you see a lot on vintage layouts are buttons and ribbons. Handwritten notes are always great. I would love to be able to incorporate something here like a postcard from my mother or some of her writing, and I may have to dig some of that out and add that later to the pocket. So now I'm going to go ahead and adhere that 11 3/4 base that I've really distressed a lot, and then I think we can place the arches and just see what we're going to do for some clusters and some elements on the page. Of course, we're focusing on an old photo, so black and white or sepia photos really keep the vintage, keep that vintage vibe. Again, torn and deckled edges softens the look, distressing the edges of the photo mats, or you can even add photo corners. That's a popular thing too. Adding any kind of meaningful memorabilia like copies of old letters, copies of birth certificates, postcards, little snippets of vintage fabric. I even considered with this one a little bit of burlap might be something that might be cool. Anything that has family genealogy. So if you have little charts that you could decorate in a decorative way, I'm just going to list a lot of that inside my flip flap. But sheet music is kind of cool. Old book pages or maps or newspapers. Tim Holtz's one with Graphic 45 has paper collections that have a lot of really, really cool vintage designs. And I know he is very popular for heritage or vintage things. He does a lot with like gears and wheels and clocks and metals and things like that. Stamping and stenciling is great. So script, floral, clock stamps, all kinds of things like that create nice subtle accents on heritage or vintage pages. I've also seen people use textured paste and stencils or masks, embossing powders in like gold, bronze, or antique finishes. And I really see myself adding a little bit of bronze. I do have some bronze foil paper, and for the life of me, I have looked all over on the SU website. I feel like it came in a multi-pack where there was maybe like some black foil, bronze foil, and gold foil, but for the life of me, I can't find it again. But if I do find it, I will link it in the description. But most of us do in our stash have a little bit of brushed gold or brushed bronze or some little scraps of specialty paper. Now I'm actually pulling out my friends of the forest, my storybook friends, there we go. My storybook friends dies with these little vintage frames. And I got to thinking to myself, I think these frames would fit perfectly in the arches, and I could snip them off, and parts of them are going to be covered, but it would have that little rounded, delicate element to soften the layout. I think that this style of a frame just screams heritage and vintage, and I did it in very vanilla. I die cut it in very vanilla, and then I'm going to distress the edges of that, and it really feels old-fashioned to me. I know grandmother had many different frames and things like this. I think she even had a little purse mirror that had some edges like this. Again, distress, distress, distress. We're distressing everything. Pecan pie is my friend. It reminds me of the Close to My Heart toffee, and I did everything in toffee, and I thought that I would just cry and cry and that I would never be able to ever find anything to replace toffee, and pecan pie is my new best friend. It's wonderful for dirtying up the edges of everything. So it is a little bit bittersweet looking at this photo. I do think it was an Easter Sunday photo in 1968. My brother, who passed this last summer, is a year apart from me. We're just 14 months apart. And then my mother has been gone for a long, long time. And so it's a special photo. I do have a younger brother who was born after this photo. And I think the next photos that we have were literally 6 or 7 years later that were family photos that were actually professionally taken. And so these are pretty special. I think, to my knowledge, they are the only family photos that we have of me under the age of 2 until I'm about 10. And I don't have any newborn photos, family photos of me, or any photos of me prior to the age 2, and no family photos of myself and my family after the age of 2. We do have some snapshots, but I don't have any formal family photos, so it's pretty rare. Okay, so now I'm feeling good about the arches and the frames, and I'm going to place the flip flap. So if you've never used a flip flap before, there is a strip of adhesive on the edge of a flip flap that you can fold under a photo mat, and you just simply line up the photo on the photo mat and then overlap the adhesive layer. Now, lots of people put their flip-flaps on the front of page protectors, or they actually make a slit in their page protector so that they're interactive, but they're on the outer part of the page protector so that people don't have to pull the layout out of the outer page protector to be able to view what's inside the flip-flap. Now, I'm putting hidden journaling inside mine, so they could potentially pull it out, but also you would want them to know that it has that interactive element in it. So now I'm going to take some pecan pie second generation, or stamp off and back on again, and I'm going to use the leaf that is from the stamp that comes right in the Botanical Textures. And I think that's going to work perfect. So I've done my journaling by typing in a Word document and printing it on very vanilla cardstock, and then trimming it down to the 5x7 and then stamping the leaf on the corners. And I love that. I think that just is very understated. It's very simple, but yet very vintage feeling. And I do end up doing the same thing with a second 5x7 under the flap. But at this point in the video, I really didn't know what I was going to say on that one. So now I have some added frames, and I've cut one of those frames with the Botanical Textures Designer Series paper. Actually, both of those are with the woven textures. So one is the burlap and one is a little bit of the braided rope. I've also created some black cardstock using the embossing folder, the 3D corrugated embossing folder, and I'm going to take an emery board and I'm going to distress that, and then I'm going to back those frames with it. So I have that linen looking piece and a little bit of that woven burlap piece for the two frames, and then I have the rounded frame from the Storybook Friends in black. So just a variety of vintage frames. We've had a lot of dies in the past that have little frames in them, so it really doesn't matter, just so they have a little bit of a vintage feel. And I'm just going to trim around that corrugated black now. I feel like that distressed corrugated black just gives it an interesting element. There doesn't have to be anything else inside the frames, but of course I'm going to dirty it up with the pecan pie. Sorry about that. I cut myself off there. All right, so now as I dirty up the frames, I'm kind of just thinking in my mind that we do need a little bit of a vintage feeling clock. So I've cut a couple of these clocks at about 7 inches from the Cricut, one in black and one in very vanilla, and I'll link the #M number, the ID number to the Cricut file in the description. For those of you that don't know how, when you're in your canvas and you click on images and you're searching for images, you just simply type that #M number and it will pull up the image within your Cricut, so you don't have to be searching for exactly the right clock. It's a great identifier to find different images in Cricut. So I see myself just doing a little bit of fun layering here. I'm just going to layer those frames, layer those clocks, and add a little bit of an eclectic cluster of vintage icons. Now, I do think I mentioned earlier that I'd like to add a little bit of bronze or brass to this. I just really want this to be sort of a photo page because it's only one photo and it's a super special photo today. And I always think that my mother was so beautiful in this photo. So when my mother was growing up, she had really long, thick red hair. She was a redhead, so the black and white photo doesn't show how flaming red her hair is, but I love the cut. It's so stylish, and she literally drew her eyebrows on her whole life until her death, because as a redhead, she just didn't have much for eyebrows. And I always got a kick out of watching her. She would call it doing her face. No, putting her face on. That's what it was. No matter how old you are, you miss your mama. It's always hard to lose your mama. So, and she did not make it as long as I would have loved, and I felt like she had a life of being sick for many, many years before she passed, and then she passed young as well. So this is a special photo for me. So I've created some 1/8-inch strips with the bronze paper. I've created several little bits and pieces out of the on-the-go tags. So I created one bendable tag that had a top and a bottom that was perforated, and I actually pulled those pieces apart. I created each of the little keys in that set, and then one of the little locks in that set. I'm not sure at this point in the video what I'm going to do with the extra keys, but I think I will use the little lock and key and hook it right onto the edge of that frame. But I do feel like I need something, and I don't know what. So I'm going to dig back into my stash, and I'm going to grab the Flowers of Beauty. Flowers of Beauty has these 2 flourish leaf pieces that I've used and used over and over again. They just make great flourishes on all kinds of layouts. So I've cut a couple of those. There's just 2 different styles that I've cut out of those, and I'm going to cut one of those apart so that I can use the leaf next to the little tag just to give me an extra little something to tuck under there. And then I'll have 2 longer flourishes that I can use that will kind of give a little bit of height to the circles, and just a little bit of height there sticking up, and then you'll have a little bit of up and down with those elements, and I think it's going to be just right. I don't want to overdo it, but I do want a lot of that little brushed bronze. Doesn't it just twinkle? It looks so pretty. Now I've also cut a family title off of the Cricut, and I've layered it with very vanilla black and some of that bronze paper, just a little bit to give it that nice little glimmery touch. And I think the swirl on the bottom of the family also feels vintage, like a vintage title. So on the original sketch, the title was across the 2 arches that were on the left-hand side. So those 2 arches for me, because I rotated the sketch, are on the bottom left now. I also cut out a few of the hearts from that same on-the-go die set. Now the on the go, you're going to see that in March, but it's actually a very colorful travel set. But I'm using it in a more muted fashion with those little vintage keys. I love them. I love that little lock and key hanging on the frame, and I feel like it really gives my layout a heritage feel or a vintage feel. We're getting there. I'm getting happy. I hope that you're getting happy too. I really love how it's turned out and how I'm able to document a very rare family photo from 1968. I just chose to put some names and dates and ages and birth and death dates in the inside of the flap to be able to document that. And then I wrote a story as to why this family photo was special to me and a few little memories of my mother and my brother who are now gone. I hope you've enjoyed this sketch hop and this layout, and that you'll check out all 8 videos. The link to the sketch hop is in the description, and I can't wait to see everyone else's take on this sketch. Come back soon for more right here on Snips by Kelly.